Draco and I spent the next hour trying unsuccessfully to leave the grounds of the Malfoy Manor.
I don't understand,
he eventually said, collapsing to his knees at the very edge of the gardens where we'd made our final attempt. His form was flickering worse than ever, a phenomenon which all our efforts to depart seemed to exacerbate. He stared down at his hands as they wavered treacherously on the edge of tangibility.
Is this the shade's doing? How can it keep me tethered to this place when it's not even here?
I glanced nervously over my shoulder. I could still see the shade, in fact, its too tall form bent unnaturally under the open French doors leading into the kitchen. It had been hovering in my periphery ever since I'd first pulled us out of the nightmare. I decided it better not to mention that to Draco. I don't think it's consciously doing anything to you, I said. I think the magic holding you here, in fact, the magic that started this whole process, is less a malicious entity and more of a reaction.
A reaction to what?
Draco asked, staring despairingly up at me. Grief, I answered, shrugging. Trauma. Ambient dark magic finds pain like bugs find light. Enough of it, plus enough time.
But if it reacts to me, then surely it should react to my desire to get the fuck out of here!
It was strange hearing him shout. The volume, the echo, were odd contrasts to the way it was cut through with short bursts of silence, as though through a tinny radio connection. I sighed and ushered him toward the center of the garden, where the flickering wasn't as bad. You want to leave now, but you spent a long time hiding yourself away, I said. This kind of magic is stubborn. I'm sure the way you insist on warping the veil does not help. I startled at the sound of Dumbledore's voice. The spirits drawn to me hadn't had much time to speak or even to manifest during the last hour or so Draco and I had spent frantically running around the manor trying to leave. I should have anticipated that they'd catch up with me eventually.
Merlin,
Draco breathed.
Headmaster.
My throat felt thick. Sorry, I haven't had the opportunity to... In order to communicate with you better through the veil, I had to drag a dangerous artifact out of its well-earned grave, Sirius admonished from behind me. My skin crawled with a frantic mix of shame and grief, and I couldn't bring myself to look at him.
Cousin?
Draco said, startled. Cousin, Sirius echoed neutrally.
Potter, not that I'm not grateful for your help. I am, I assure you. But both of us being chased by ghosts seems like too much to handle.
Harry insists that it's necessary.
Potter, is that me, Mother?
I screwed my eyes shut. Yes, I managed to answer, barely. A few moments of unbearable silence lapsed. When I forced myself to look, Draco was staring at the translucent figure of my dead mother, looking gobsmacked.
It's,
he eventually said,
nice to meet you?
She smiled gently at him. It's nice to meet you too, even in these unusual circumstances. And what of me? Do I get no greeting?
Severus!
I watched as he emerged from behind Moody, his expression bittersweet, and kinder than I'd ever seen it. Hello, Draco. My, how you've grown. After a few protracted moments of silence, Draco launched himself forward and, to my surprise, was met with a returned embrace. He was, it seemed, still more ghost than man at this point, and was able to touch the dead more readily than the living. I felt an absurd stab of jealousy, and tried to pretend I didn't.
I've missed you,
Draco said, voice ruined. Whereas I, on the other hand, have been quite content to wait out your very long life before ever seeing you on my side of the veil. He withdrew enough from the embrace to tuck a lock of pale hair behind Draco's ear. I'd never seen Snape so affectionate before, and wondered with a maudlin pang if this was the sort of relationship I could have earned with Sirius, with enough time. I glanced over at him. His dark eyes met mine with suspicion. A cold wind came howling down the river that ran behind the manor, and I shivered, hugging my conjured cloak around my shoulders to insufficient effect.
I don't understand,
Draco eventually said, withdrawing enough to stare at him in wonderment.
How are you here? How are any of you here?
Harry keeps dragging us back, Lupin said. I have the resurrection stone, I told Draco, my voice thick. Do you know the Deathly Hallows?
Of course I do,
he answered, before promptly turning to...
You have the resurrection stone?
I got it back during the war, I explained. It warps the veil between life and death, pulls through loved ones of whoever has it. I have quite a few people in my life that I've loved and lost. Draco stared at me with intensity for a time. I'm sure my expression spoke volumes.
Maybe you should put it back where it came from,
he said slowly. I shook my head. It was the only thing strong enough to let me talk to you, to weaken the veil enough to let me cast magic to get from one side to the other. It's necessary. Trust me, if I thought I could do without... Sorry to be such a burden to you, Sirius growled.
Hey,
Draco protested at once.
Take it easy. That's not what he meant.
It's all right, I said. It's not... Their resentment makes sense. Draco frowned at me like I was a puzzle he was having trouble solving. When the silence stretched on too long, he eventually said,
So then, what now?
I hate to just leave you here, I said, but I don't think there's much of an option. I need to do some research, maybe consult a few unspeakables about your condition.
Why not ask Granger? If memory serves, she knows just about everything.
I didn't quite know what to say. That I had already tried to ask Hermione for help and failed to force the words out. That I'd been ignoring her for months in the depths of my solitude. That I knew, in the darkest parts of my soul, that even if she agreed to help, that I wouldn't really deserve it. She's pregnant, I ended up saying. Nearly full term. I don't think now's the time to expose her to this much dark magic. As ever, too stubborn to ask for help, Dumbledore disparaged, which made me flinch. Draco's frown moved briefly to the late headmaster, deepened. I can come back with your mother, if you'd like, I said. She was eager to hear of my progress. I'm sure she'd love to...
No,
he interjected.
No, I don't... Not like this.
What?
I don't want her to see me like this. I don't want to upset her.
I frowned. I understood the impulse, I supposed, even as I didn't quite agree with it.
If you ever manage to...
When? He flinched.
When you manage to fix this,
he said, staring down at his hands as they flickered in and out of existence.
I'll see her then.
She will not think less of you, Draco, Snape intoned gently.
Maybe not, but she very well may blame herself.
His thumb was tracing the length of his opposite arm where, underneath the sleeve of his dressing gown, I wondered if the scars from his suicide attempt still lingered. Memories of red blood on white sheets rose in the back of my mind like bile. I tried to ignore them. Test the limits of your physicality while I'm gone, I said. And your magic. You must still have it. I saw you banish Armand.
He'll be back,
Draco answered glumly.
He always comes back, the obdurate old bastard. I've been banishing him since I was 16, and it never sticks longer than a few hours.
At least you still can. I'll be back in the morning, all right? Try to stay out of reach of... I looked over my shoulder again. The shade was gone from the double French doors, a realization that made my skin crawl. It had been following me for an hour now. Where...
Potter?
I dragged my gaze back over to him, but not before scanning the length of the garden. There was no sign of it.
Wherever you go, whoever you consult, maybe store the stone somewhere else. I think the magic of this place is affecting it.
I swallowed. I don't think I can. Can't bear our presence, Cedric said, sounding cross. It's hard. I said. I wasn't sure to who. I can't take it with me. Draco frowned, sighed.
Well, I am not in much of a position to stop you. And for what it's worth, thank you, Potter. I mean it. I don't think there's any other Auror alive who'd help me like this.
Harry.
What?
The last time he'd said my given name, he'd had his legs around my waist and his fingertips digging into my skin. I ached to reclaim any part of that feeling, since touch was now a luxury between us. Call me Harry, I said.
Harry,
he echoed. A tiny thrill raced through me. I reached out, unthinking, to skate my fingertips across the curve of his jaw. My hand passed right through. His expression was wounded and confused and complicated. I'll be back, I said, and turned back toward the manor, which was when I saw it. The shade was standing by the willow tree, so tremendously tall and thin that for a second I thought it had grown a second trunk. My breathing picked up. I decided to leave the stone on the nearest branch and apparate back to London straight from the garden. Magical theory knew very little about death. On its own, this was not entirely surprising. Science didn't know much more. Hundreds of thousands of years of exploring the world and our own place in it, and all our methods of understanding ran headlong into the huge, opaque wall that was death. So far as I was able to tell from that evening's worth of research, no one had ever truly been brought back from the dead. Perhaps excepting myself, and even that was up for debate. All these years later, I still wasn't completely sure of what had happened to me the second time I'd been hit by Voldemort's killing curse. So it stood to reason that Draco was not an exception. He'd certainly made an effort to die, but had never truly passed through the veil. Trelawney had described him as tangled in it, which comported with my own efforts to extricate him. But now that he was free, parts of him were missing. The questions that remained were, which parts, and how would one go about getting them back? There was only one person I could think to ask, and who I could bear to see. I went back to Hogwarts to visit her again, and when I explained what had happened, she looked confounded. "This is much more complex than I expected," Trelawney said. Snow was falling outside her office window, blanketing the highlands, but inside, the hearth was full of bright fire. The beaded curtain hanging over the open door clattered quietly against itself with the cross breeze from the classroom. I nodded wearily. I'm at a loss. I don't even really understand how he got to be this way. How am I meant to fix it? He is rather behaving like a ghost, she mused, drumming her long fingers on the edge of her desk, piled high with ungraded papers. Tethered to the ground, insubstantial, or at least partially. What does that imply? I'm not sure. Maybe nothing. But there are certain magics that can give ghosts a physical form temporarily. Are there? I asked, surprised. They're obscure, to be sure, and complex, but they would not be a bad place to start. Even if they don't work, the manner in which they fail may tell you more about the nature of his condition. I am more concerned with this shade. You said it saw you. I caught a glimpse of it while I was there, and if it's truly digesting him... Do you have any ideas on how to get rid of it? Ideally something more permanent than banishment? I doubt banishment would work at all. Mr. Malfoy is behaving like a ghost, but this thing... She shook her head. I felt nothing in it. No emotion, no empathy, no awareness past determining what it can consume. It doesn't think, it doesn't feel, it just eats. Her fingers had stopped drumming on the desk. Her hazel eyes went slightly unfocused. There are few things more powerful, she said, more primal than hunger. I went back to the Malfoy Manor the next day, exhausted. Between the last-minute trip to Hogwarts, the piles of books I'd been poring over, and the bloody damn ghoul in the attic of Grimmauld Place, I'd been spending a lot of energy that I hadn't been recovering adequately. The snow that had covered Scotland was, this far south, nothing more than dreary, freezing cold rain. Now, in addition to the white frost covering the building, treacherous black ice coated the stone paths and slate roof with an eerie, uncanny shine. I walked very carefully around the back of the building, to the garden where I'd left the resurrection stone. Draco appeared in front of me the second I picked it up.
"Armand is gone,"
he said. What?
"He's gone."
Draco repeated. He was still wearing the dressing gown, open just enough to reveal the endless length of his neck. It caused me to wonder if he could still feel the cold in his present state. Then I wondered a few other things about his skin that didn't feel especially relevant.
"It's been hours, and he hasn't shown back up. He's really, properly, completely gone."
I frowned. Are you sure? Perhaps he's just sulking. He's gone, affirmed a voice from behind me, and I nearly leapt out of my skin at the sound. When I spun, I saw Jean-Eloise standing by a huge dead rosebush, head down, hands wringing together. "I've searched for him, and he's nowhere to be found. I think...
"The shade got him,"
Draco said.
"I'm sure of it."
I stared, bewildered. Got him?
Banishment weakens a ghost,
Jean-Eloise explained.
It makes them invisible and insubstantial for a time. In most cases, with sufficient willpower, the ghost can reassert itself. Armand is very old and very powerful. He should have returned by now.
"This is my fault,"
Draco said, pushing his hands through his hair, expression wild and frantic and horrified.
"If I'd known that banishment would have made him vulnerable..."
"But you didn't," I said. "And I mean, he is sort of awful."
"He's been haunting this manor for 600 years,"
Draco protested.
"He's part of my family's history."
"Perhaps one of the parts best done away with." Stubbornly, Draco shook his head.
"I can't ignore the bad parts of my legacy any more than I can ignore the mark on my arm. Mistakes must be acknowledged lest they're repeated. And there are certain mistakes that I refuse to repeat."
For a time, I stared at him in silence. There was an alarming, persistent throbbing in the center of my chest. My heart, I reluctantly acknowledged, and at the same time acknowledged that perhaps my intentions toward Draco Malfoy were a bit deeper than I'd anticipated. How, I wondered, had he come out of the war and a dozen years of self-imposed solitude as eloquent as he was? God, but he had become something remarkable.
"I'll continue looking for him,"
Jean-Eloise suggested faintly.
"Ghosts gain some strength at night, perhaps at dusk."
But she didn't sound confident. I managed to drag my eyes away from Draco long enough to see her soar up through one of the third-story windows in the manor and out of sight.
"I feel awful,"
Draco admitted, voice small.
"He was a bastard, but he deserved better."
I swallowed and tried very hard not to fall in love with him. "Trelawney has an idea," I said. We set up in one of the less dilapidated parts of the manor, a cleared-out room in the northeastern corner of the building, which I suspected used to be a sitting room. I lit a large fireplace against the exterior wall, which would have been cheerful if it weren't the only light source in the room, and we sat together on a large Persian rug between two settees covered by white dustcloths.
"How long does the incantation take to cast?"
he asked me. "According to the few texts I found on it, several minutes at least," I answered. "It's not especially difficult magic, but it is tedious and exacting." "Tedious and exacting have never been your strong suits," Lupin said. I sighed. I'd been sitting still long enough for all my ghosts to gather, hovering like grim spectres at the edges of the room. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, but the lot of them seemed more dour, somehow more grim.
I really don't think you should be leaving the resurrection stone here,
Draco said.
This feels wrong.
I shook my head. Their anger isn't unreasonable. I'm dragging them through the veil against their will.
These people loved you in life,
Draco insisted.
They would never treat you like this.
They might if I was the one who let them die. Draco frowned at me. In the firelight that couldn't quite illuminate him, he flickered between silvery translucent and burnished gold, a constantly shifting marble of precious metals across his skin.
Do you really believe that?
He asked softly. I could think of nothing I wanted to discuss less, so I drew my wand instead. I'm going to start, I said. Try to stay very still. The magic needs time to settle correctly. He sighed, but acquiesced silently. He shifted slightly, finding a more comfortable position on his knees, and closed his eyes. I allowed myself only a few seconds of staring before I set to work. Once the incantation was over, long lines of whispered Latin, all that remained was sustaining the energy and letting it suffuse him, which required little more than concentration. Which is why I found myself chafing slightly when, from my left, Dumbledore said, "You always did have an unusual fascination with Mr. Malfoy." I licked my lips. The magic wasn't so finicky that it would be ruined by speaking, but I was still reluctant to answer for my own reasons. Dumbledore's loss had been more traumatizing than most of the others. The knowledge that he had gone willingly, that Snape's killing curse had been an act of mercy, did not ease the memories. Teachers always see more, understand more than their students surmise. It was certainly obvious to me, at least, that your disdain for one another always ran with a current of mutual obsession. History rarely repeats itself verbatim, but it frequently rhymes. You were not the first Potter under my tutelage to develop a fixation with an unhappy child of House Black. I looked sideways at him, nervous, then looked back at Draco, who hadn't seemed to hear. The magic had taken hold of him, and he was swaying slightly, in something like a trance, as it settled into him. Dumbledore was not done speaking in any case. "Have I surprised you? The rivalry between your father and Regulus Black was legendary. Both seekers on their house team, both beloved scions of ancient lines, both burdened with expectations beyond what they ever wanted, and both chafing at their lots in life in their own ways. But then, it's not a perfect echo. Regulus Black went willingly into his fate. Draco was pushed." My mouth was moving. I could not make words form. "I wonder, Harry," Dumbledore continued, voice eerie in its frostiness, "when you saw Mr. Malfoy slashing open his wrists, did any part of you twinge under the weight of your culpability?" Something hard and painful lurched in the pit of my stomach. When I looked over at Dumbledore, his face was melting, blue eyes blackening, skin sloughing off like those in that horrible pyre that had once burned in the cellar of this very manor. My breath got heavy and unsteady. Or were you always so self-obsessed that you could not imagine what kind of world you were throwing him in once the madman he'd been forced to serve hit the ground? Invisible flames climbed up, one eye burst, fluid dribbling down his cheek like a runny egg yolk before boiling away entirely. Did you really think killing Voldemort would have been enough? His death left the Ministry in shambles and drove half the Sacred 28 away from English shores. All that history, that legacy, that knowledge, fleeing the wolves you left behind, because you couldn't be bothered to dirty your hands cleaning up the aftermath of your actions. Headmaster, I whispered, voice wavering, and his teeth were turning black, and his skull was visible now, turning grey and ashy and caving in, but still he spoke, voice gurgling through the unseen flames. So what choice did Draco Malfoy have but to slash his wrists open? His country hated him, his family's legacy indelibly stained. What did he have left? What did you leave him worth living for? Foolish, reckless, cruel child. Stop, I said, and there was a shadow looming behind him as he burned and burned. And now you have the audacity to love him? Love is reciprocal. What have you done to earn it? What have you ever done to earn anyone's love? The only good thing you've ever done is die in a useful way. The shade lunged. I scrambled backward, wand out. The spell I cast at it was reflexive, sailing through it and hitting the fireplace, which exploded in a burst of red-orange light. And then it was gone, and the room was empty. My back was against the covered settee, the only thing holding me up as I wheezed and shook and felt the darkness creeping in.